The colder the rain, the fewer the visitors. And Sergeant First Class Nora Callahan had spent the last 14 months making sure of it. The hollow outside Harlan, Kentucky, didn't have a name on any map. It sat tucked between two ridgelines that seemed to lean toward each other like old men, sharing a secret, and the gravel road that wound up to Nora's property was unmarked, unpaved, and deliberately left that way. She'd filled the worst ruts with gravel herself, then reconsidered and scooped half of it back out. A bad road kept people away. A bad road was an asset. She lived in a stone and timber house that had belonged to her grandfather, a coal miner who'd understood instinctively that the mountain was something you worked with, not against. The house had good bones, thick walls, a cast-iron wood stove that could heat the main room in under 20 minutes, a porch that faced east so you could see the sunrise coming before it arrived. Nora had added a reinforced door, 3 deadbolts, and motion-activated lights that covered every angle of approach. Her grandfather would not have recognized what she'd done to the place. She suspected he would have understood it anyway. The dog's name was Ghost. He was a Belgian Malinois, 7 years old, retired from the 75th Ranger Regiment's military working dog program 18 months before Nora herself had separated from the army. He had a scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his jaw. A souvenir from Kandahar that matched, in some cosmic symmetry, the one Nora carried along her left collarbone. He weighed 62 pounds and could clear a 6-foot fence from a standing position. He slept at the foot of her bed every night and spent his days moving between the porch and the wood stove with the patient, deliberate energy of an animal that was never entirely off duty. Ghost did not like strangers. This was not aggression. Not exactly. It was something more precise than that. He would position himself between Nora and any unfamiliar person, lower his head to shoulder level and watch. Not growl, not bark. Just watch, with those pale amber eyes, until the person either left or Nora gave him a signal that said they were safe. In 14 months, she had given that signal twice. Once for the propane delivery man after 3 separate deliveries. Once for the woman from the county road crew who'd come to ask about a drainage easement and brought homemade jam as an opening offer. Everyone else, Ghost watched until they left. Nora thought this was a perfectly reasonable system. The morning it all changed started the way most mornings did, badly. She woke at 0430 from the same dream she'd been having since Mosul. Not a nightmare exactly, more like a very specific kind of grief wearing a nightmare's clothes. In the dream, her team leader, Staff Sergeant Kevin Abrams, was trying to tell her something through 2 inches of ballistic glass, and she could see his mouth moving but couldn't hear the words, and the glass kept fogging from his breath, and she kept wiping her side of it, as if that would help. She lay there in the dark, listening to Ghost breathe. Then she got up, put on the kettle, and stood on the porch in her thermals, watching the fog move through the hollow like something alive. The ache in her left hip had been worse all week. She knew the signs by now, barometric pressure dropping, weather coming, and she ignored the ache the way she ignored most things about her own body these days, with focused determination and a certain amount of spite. She'd been a medic for 6 years. She knew better than anyone what the body was capable of refusing to say until it had no choice. By mid-morning, she was splitting wood behind the house, a job that required enough concentration to quiet the parts of her mind that preferred not to be quiet. Ghost lay in the dry patch under the back eave and watched her work. The rhythm of it, set, swing, split, stack, was one of the things that still made sense. She didn't notice how cold her hands had gotten until she missed a swing and the maul glanced off the log, and she felt nothing in her fingers when the handle kicked back. That was the first sign, and she ignored it. The second sign was at noon, when she sat down to eat and realized she had no appetite. She'd made soup, a real one, from a stock she'd simmered all morning, the way her grandmother had taught her, and she sat in front of it for 10 minutes and couldn't make herself pick up the spoon. Ghost came and put his chin on her knee and looked up at her. "I'm fine," she told him. He didn't move. "I'm fine," she said again. It came out thinner the second time. By 2 in the afternoon, the ache in her hip had spread upward, and she was shivering despite the wood stove being fully loaded. She took her own temperature with the clinical thermometer she kept in the first aid kit, old habit, medic's habit, and stared at the reading for a long moment. 103.4. She sat down on the edge of the bed and did what she always did when confronted with information she didn't want. She assessed it, methodically, clinically. She catalogued the symptoms: fever, chills, diffuse ache, the hip pain that had been escalating for days. And she followed the chain of probability the way her training had taught her, and she arrived at a conclusion she didn't like. The hip had been bothering her since a training fall 18 months ago. There was a surgical repair that hadn't healed quite right. She'd known that, and managed it, and declined the follow-up procedures 3 times, because the follow-up procedures required her to be in a hospital, surrounded by strangers, in a bed that wasn't hers. And she had decided, in that cold, certain, completely irrational way, that she would rather live with the hip than with the alternative. The chain of probability followed honestly, led to sepsis. She sat with that word for a moment. Then she went and got her go-bag. Getting down the mountain with 103 degrees of fever and a hip that was now screaming was an exercise in focused misery. She drove the old Bronco in 4-wheel drive, hands tight on the wheel, Ghost pressed against her right side in the passenger seat because she hadn't told him to get in the back and he hadn't volunteered. The road seemed longer than it ever had. Every rut she'd deliberately preserved was a small punishment. She made it to the valley floor and then to Route 119, and then she drove 11 miles to the Harlan ARH Regional Medical Center, and she pulled into the emergency bay and sat there for a full 60 seconds before she could make herself get out. Ghost got out with her. The triage nurse, a compact, efficient woman in her 50s named Helen, saw Nora first and then saw Ghost and said, in the flat, experienced tone of someone who had seen everything, "Ma'am, there's a no-pets policy. He's a service animal," Nora said, "and I think I have sepsis." Helen looked at Ghost. Ghost looked at Helen. The fur along his shoulders had risen by a precise 1/4 inch, not aggression, just awareness, and his eyes didn't leave the nurse's face. Helen made a decision. "This way," she said. They moved fast after that. A wheelchair appeared. Nora didn't remember sitting in it, but then she was in it, and they were through the doors and into the controlled chaos of the ER, and then into a bay with a curtain, and someone was taking her blood pressure, and someone else was asking her questions, and Ghost positioned himself between the bed and the curtain and didn't move. The numbers came back the way she'd expected. Blood pressure low, heart rate elevated. The blood work that came back 40 minutes later said what she already knew. Septicemia, source likely the hip joint, the infection that had been building for weeks behind a barrier of deliberate inattention. "We need to admit you," said the attending physician, a younger man named Dr. Park, who had the particular energy of someone who slept 4 hours a night and ran on conviction. "You're looking at IV antibiotics, probably surgery to clean out the joint. Minimum 3 days inpatient." "Okay," Nora said. Dr. Park blinked. He'd clearly expected a fight. "Okay," she said again. "But the dog stays." That was when things got complicated. Ghost would not allow the nursing staff to approach the bed to change her IV. Not in a violent way. He didn't snap, didn't lunge, but he would rise from his position, lower his head, and place himself in the path of whoever was coming. And the quality of his attention was enough. 2 experienced nurses stopped in their tracks. A third tried to go around him and he simply moved to match her angle, and she stopped too. The charge nurse, a woman named Linda who had 30 years of ER experience, and the bearing of someone who had negotiated peace treaties in break rooms, came and stood at the curtain. "Sergeant Callahan," she said, "we need to access your IV line. The dog needs to allow that." "I know," Nora said. She was exhausted. The fever was climbing again, and the hip was a white-hot line of pain. "Ghost," "Stand down." Ghost turned and looked at her. She gave him the hand signal, flat palm, fingers down, held for 2 seconds. He looked at Linda. He looked back at Nora. Then he went and lay down by the wall, facing the curtain, and Linda changed the IV with hands that only shook a little. This became the pattern. Ghost would let the nurses work when Nora gave him the signal, but the signal had to come from her every time, and he watched every person who came through that curtain with the full weight of his attention, and nobody who came in was entirely comfortable. And Nora was too sick to do much about it. She slept in pieces. An hour here, 40 minutes there, and each time she surfaced, Ghost was in the same position by the wall, watching the curtain. Once, at 3 in the morning, she woke from the Mosul dream again and lay shaking for a moment, and Ghost was beside her before she'd fully surfaced, pressing his warm weight against her arm, and she put her hand on the back of his neck and held on until the shaking stopped. On the second day, Dr. Park came in with the results of the MRI and the plan for the surgery, and while he was talking, Nora watched Ghost watch him, and she thought, "This is what you do when everything else has broken. You find the one thing that won't and you don't let go." The surgery was scheduled for the following morning. That afternoon, a woman appeared at the curtain. She didn't knock. There was no door to knock on, but she paused there in the gap, and something about the way she paused made Nora look up from the ceiling where she'd been conducting a pointless inventory of the ceiling tiles. The woman was in her late 30s. She wore the blue scrubs of the hospital staff, but there was something in her posture that read different from the nurses and techs who'd been cycling through. Something with more stillness in it, more deliberateness. She had dark circles under her eyes and the kind of jaw that suggested she'd been clenching her teeth for a long time. Ghost was already on his feet. He moved to the foot of the bed, head low, and faced her. The woman didn't back up. Most people backed up. "I heard about you," the woman said to Nora. Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, something careful, like a hand held open to show it held nothing. "Night staff talks. I'm sorry you're here." "I'm sorry too," Nora said. "I'm Rachel Abrams," the woman said. "I'm a physician assistant in orthopedics. I'll be assisting in your surgery tomorrow." The name hit Nora somewhere behind the sternum. "Abrams." She made herself breathe. "Kevin Abrams," Nora said. It came out flat, because she had to say it flatly, or she wouldn't be able to say it at all. "You knew him?" Rachel's face changed in the way faces change when a name arrives that carries real weight. "He was my brother," she said. Ghost hadn't moved. He was still between the bed and the curtain, still watching Rachel with those pale amber eyes, and the room had gone very quiet the way rooms do when something true is about to happen. Nora had not said Kevin's name out loud in 14 months. She had not spoken to anyone who had known him. She had gone up the mountain and pulled the hollow around her like a coat, and she had told herself this was management, this was coping, this was what a person did. And in this moment, with the fever still burning and the hip aching, and Kevin's sister standing 6 feet away, she understood for the first time that it had not been any of those things. "I was with him," Nora said. "At the end." "I know," Rachel said. "He wrote letters. He wrote about you a lot." Ghost made a low sound, not a growl, something older than a growl, and Rachel looked at him for the first time directly. "What's his name?" she asked. "Ghost." Rachel looked at the dog the way you look at something that is more than what it appears to be. She stood very still. "Kevin had a dog," she said, "before he deployed the second time. Shepherd mix, absolutely ridiculous ears." Something moved through her expression. Not quite a smile, not quite grief, somewhere in the country between them. "He called her Echo." She said the name quietly. And Ghost, who had not permitted Rachel to take a single step past the curtain, who had watched her with professional wariness for the entire conversation, lifted his head. His ears came forward. He looked at Rachel with an expression that Nora could not entirely read but felt in her chest like a key turning in a lock. Rachel's breath caught. "Echo was his call sign," Nora said, and her voice broke on the last word. "Just slightly. just enough. Kevin's call sign. We all called him that. Echo 1. Ghost walked forward 3 steps and sat down directly in front of Rachel Abrams. It was not a signal Nora had given. There was no hand gesture, no verbal command. Ghost had made his own assessment, conducted his own evaluation, reached his own conclusion, and his conclusion was that this woman, who carried her brother's name and had said the right word without knowing it was the right word, was safe. Rachel knelt down slowly. She put out her hand, palm up, the way you do when you're asking an animal for trust rather than demanding it. Ghost looked at her hand for a long moment. Then he put his nose against her palm. Nora found she couldn't speak. Rachel stayed on her knees and kept her hand where Ghost had put his nose, and she looked up at Nora, and her eyes were wet. "He said you were the best medic he'd ever worked with," she said. "He said you kept your head when everything was going wrong. He said that about you specifically." "He was wrong," Nora said. "I should have gotten him out faster. I've been—" She stopped, started again. "I've been up that mountain running a loop of every decision I made and every decision I should have made instead, for 14 months, and I can't." She put her hand over her eyes. "I can't stop running it." Rachel was quiet for a moment. Ghost was still sitting in front of her, pressed now lightly against her knee, and Rachel had her hand on the back of his neck, in the same place Nora held him at 3 in the morning. "Kevin used to say," Rachel said carefully, "that the difference between a good medic and a perfect medic was that a good medic could be wrong and keep working. A perfect medic would freeze." She looked up. "He said perfect medics get people killed. He said good medics save them." The words arrived in Nora like something physical. "He's not here to tell you he doesn't blame you," Rachel said. "I know that, but I knew him for 34 years, and I know what he would say. And he would say, 'Nora, that you are running the wrong loop.'" It was the first time anyone had said her first name in a way that expected something from her in a very long time. Ghost turned and walked back to the bed and lay down against it and put his chin on the mattress beside her hand. Nora put her hand on top of his head and held it there and cried. Quietly, without drama, the way people cry when they've been holding something for 14 months. And the container finally cracks, and Rachel Abrams sat in the chair beside the bed and didn't try to make it stop or say anything to fix it, because she understood that it didn't need to be fixed, it needed to be felt. The surgery went well. Dr. Park came out afterward with the satisfied expression of a man who'd found what he was looking for and removed it, and told Nora's chart that the infection was fully evacuated and the joint looked better than expected, and barring complications she'd be mobile in 6 weeks with proper physical therapy. Rachel scrubbed in and scrubbed out without any of it being strange. She came by Nora's recovery room once, still in her surgical cap, and gave her a thumbs up, and Ghost, who was technically not supposed to be in the recovery room, but had been moved there anyway because the alternative was apparently worse, lifted his head and thumped his tail once against the floor. 2 days later, when Nora was cleared to leave, Rachel came by with a piece of paper that had her number on it. "You're going back up the mountain," Rachel said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, okay." Rachel glanced at Ghost, who was watching her with the attentive warmth he'd developed for her over the past 2 days, the warmth he gave to approximately nobody else on Earth. "I'd like to come up sometime." "If that's okay," Kevin talked about Eastern Kentucky, said he wanted to see it. Nora looked at the paper in her hand. 14 months. She'd spent 14 months making sure that road was too bad for anyone to use. She'd pulled the ruts and unpaved the verge and turned off every light that might have been visible from below, and she'd told herself this was safety, this was discipline, this was what it meant to manage the damage. Ghost pressed against her left leg the way he always did when she was upright and uncertain, a steady warm weight. "I'm here, still here." "The road's rough," Nora said. "You'll need a truck, not a car." "I have a truck," Rachel said. Nora folded the paper and put it in the breast pocket of the flannel shirt she'd been brought from home. "Give me a couple of weeks," she said. To get back on my feet. Take 3, Rachel said. I'm not going anywhere. Outside the hospital doors, the Kentucky morning was cold and silver, and the mountains rose up in the east the way they always did, with that particular permanence that mountains have, indifferent to individual tragedy, outlasting it, still there when the long grief finally lifted. Nora stood at the Bronco for a moment before she got in. Ghost jumped into the passenger seat without being invited and pressed against the door and turned his face forward. She thought about Kevin. She let herself, for once, without the loop starting. She just thought about him. The way he'd laughed, the way he said her name over the radio, the way he moved through a room like he already knew all the exits. She thought about him as a person who had existed and mattered and was gone, and she let that be true without needing to follow it somewhere terrible. Then she got in the truck and started the engine. The road back up the hollow was every bit as rough as she'd made it. She took it slowly, the Bronco rocking through the ruts, Ghost steady beside her, the bare trees closing in on both sides the way they always did, familiar as her own heartbeat. When she reached the top and the stone house came into view, dark windows, cold wood stove, 3 deadbolts waiting, she sat in the driveway for a moment. Then she got out and unlocked the door and left it standing open while she went inside to start the fire. It was a small thing. It was exactly the right size.